Katie Morgan crouched behind a pile of twisted metal and concrete, her fingers wrapped tightly around the plasma rifle she had rebuilt from salvaged alien technology. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of what used to be downtown Seattle, carrying the acrid smell of ash and burned electronics. Above her, dark clouds churned in an unnatural pattern, a lasting gift from the Zethian Empire's atmospheric weapons. She had been alone for so long that the sound of her own breathing sometimes startled her. 3 years had passed since the invasion ended, or rather since the Zethians decided Earth was no longer worth their attention. They had strip-mined the major cities, harvested whatever biological samples interested them, and left the planet to die slowly under toxic skies. The alien council that governed this region of the galaxy had officially declared humanity extinct. Just another footnote in the endless catalog of species that failed to survive first contact with superior civilizations. But Katie survived. She survived because she refused to give up, because she learned to eat strange fungi that grew in the ruins, because she taught herself to read Zethian technical manuals by candlelight in underground bunkers. She survived because she had to, because someone needed to remember that Earth had existed, that humans had built cities and written songs and loved each other under blue skies. The facility she was approaching had been marked on a Zethian map she found 2 months ago. According to the faded symbols, it was a biological research station, abandoned when the main fleet departed. Katie had raided dozens of similar sites, always hoping to find something useful, something that might help her understand why the Zethians came and why they left so abruptly. Most of the time she found only empty laboratories and corrupted data files. She moved through the rubble with practiced silence, her boots barely making a sound on the broken pavement. Years of scavenging had taught her to move like a ghost through the ruins. She had learned which surfaces made noise, which shadows offered the best cover, and how to sense when something was wrong before her conscious mind processed the danger. The entrance to the underground facility was partially collapsed, but Katie had expected that. She pulled a small cutting torch from her pack and began working on the twisted metal blocking the doorway. The blue flame cast dancing shadows on the walls around her, and for a moment she allowed herself to remember what electric lights looked like, how they used to illuminate city streets at night, creating rivers of brightness that could be seen from space. After 20 minutes of careful cutting, she had cleared an opening large enough to squeeze through. Katie activated the flashlight mounted on her rifle and descended into the darkness. The air grew colder as she moved deeper, and she could hear water dripping somewhere in the distance. The facility's emergency lights flickered weakly, drawing power from backup generators that should have died years ago, but somehow kept running on alien technology she did not fully understand. The main corridor branched in 3 directions. Katie consulted the crude map she had drawn based on the Zethian documents and chose the left passage. Her footsteps echoed softly in the empty hallway, and she fought the urge to call out just to hear another voice, even if it was only her own echo answering back. She passed through what appeared to be living quarters for the Zethian researchers. The aliens had left in a hurry, judging by the scattered equipment and half-packed containers. Katie paused to search through the debris but found nothing immediately useful. She had learned that Zethian rations tasted like plastic mixed with motor oil, so she avoided their food supplies unless absolutely desperate. The corridor opened into a massive chamber that made Katie stop in her tracks. Rows of large cylindrical tanks lined the walls, each one filled with murky fluid and connected to a web of tubes and cables. Most of the tanks were dark and empty, but as Katie swept her light across the room, she noticed 2 tanks at the far end that still glowed with a faint blue luminescence. Her heart rate quickened as she approached. Inside the first tank, she could make out a shape, something large and reptilian suspended in the preservation fluid. As she got closer, the creature's features became clearer. It had scales that shimmered with an iridescent quality, 4 powerful legs ending in clawed feet, and wings folded tightly against its body. A dragon, or at least something that looked exactly like the dragons from old Earth legends. Katie moved to the second tank and found another creature, similar to the first but with different coloring. Where the first dragon had scales that seemed to shift between blue and silver, this one displayed patterns of red and gold. Both creatures appeared to be young, perhaps adolescents based on their size relative to the tank dimensions. She found a control panel between the tanks and began examining the Zethian text scrolling across the display. Her language skills were self-taught and imperfect, but she had become proficient enough to understand technical readouts. According to the information, these creatures were genetic experiments, combinations of Earth reptile DNA with genetic material from dozens of other species. The Zethians had been trying to create the perfect bioweapon, something intelligent enough to follow complex orders but fierce enough to terrify any enemy. The project had been abandoned when the Empire withdrew, and the creatures had been left in stasis, forgotten in this underground tomb. The control panel showed their vital signs were stable but slowly declining. Without maintenance, the stasis system would fail within another month, and the dragons would die without ever having lived. Katie stared at the creatures for a long time, her mind racing through possibilities. She could walk away, leave them to their fate, continue her solitary existence scavenging through ruins, or she could do something monumentally stupid and try to wake them up. The Zethians had created them as weapons, which meant they were probably dangerous and unpredictable. But they were also alive, and they were the closest thing to company Katie had seen in 3 years. She made her decision without fully understanding why. Her fingers moved across the control panel, following the emergency release protocols outlined in the technical manual. Alarms began to sound throughout the facility, and the tanks started to drain. Katie stepped back, raising her rifle just in case, watching as the fluid levels dropped and the dragons began to stir. The blue and silver dragon opened its eyes first. They were large and intelligent, with vertical pupils that contracted as they adjusted to the light. The creature's gaze locked onto Katie, and she saw something unexpected in those alien eyes. Not aggression or hunger, but curiosity and confusion, the look of a child waking up in a strange place. The second dragon, the red and gold one, woke moments later with similar bewilderment. Both creatures were breathing now, their chests rising and falling as their lungs processed real air for the first time. They were larger than Katie had estimated, each one roughly the size of a small car, though she suspected they would grow much bigger given time and proper nutrition. The tanks opened with a hiss of releasing pressure, and the dragons stumbled out onto the laboratory floor, their legs weak from disuse. They shook themselves like wet dogs, sending droplets of stasis fluid flying across the room. Then they turned their attention to Katie, who suddenly felt very small and vulnerable standing between two genetically engineered predators. She lowered her rifle slowly, an instinctive gesture that felt right even though logic told her she was being foolish. The blue dragon took a tentative step toward her, moving with surprising grace despite its obvious disorientation. It lowered its head and sniffed at her, nostrils flaring as it processed her scent. Katie held perfectly still, barely breathing, waiting to see if she had just made the last mistake of her life. The dragon made a sound, something between a chirp and a rumble, and pressed its snout gently against her hand. The scales felt warm and smooth, like polished stone heated by the sun. Katie exhaled slowly and reached up to touch the creature's head. The red dragon approached from the other side, seeking similar contact, and suddenly Katie found herself standing between two massive reptiles that seemed to regard her with something approaching affection. She had no idea what she was going to do with two dragons in a dead world, but for the first time in 3 years, Katie Morgan did not feel completely alone. The dragons were hungry. Katie discovered this fact within the first hour of their awakening, when both creatures began making distressed sounds and nudging at her with increasing insistence. She had no idea what to feed genetically engineered bioweapons, but she started with the most obvious option and led them out of the facility to hunt for food among the ruins. The blue and silver dragon, which Katie had started calling Storm in her mind, because of the way its scales reminded her of thunderclouds, proved to be a natural hunter despite having never seen the outside world. It spotted movement among some rubble and pounced with surprising speed, emerging moments later with something that looked like a mutated rat in its jaws. The creature crunched down on its prey with obvious satisfaction. The red and gold dragon, which Katie decided to call Ember because of its coloring, took a different approach. It seemed more cautious and observant, watching Storm hunt before attempting to catch its own food. When it finally made a move, Ember displayed remarkable precision, using its claws to flip over a chunk of concrete and snap up the nest of creatures hiding underneath. Katie watched them eat and felt a strange mixture of emotions. Part of her recognized the absurdity of the situation, She was babysitting two alien war machines in the ruins of human civilization, and she had no plan beyond keeping them fed and alive. But another part of her felt something she had not experienced in years, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. Over the following weeks, Katie established a routine with the dragons. They stayed in the underground facility, which provided shelter from the toxic storms that still swept across the landscape periodically. Katie taught herself to understand their body language and vocalizations, learning to distinguish between sounds of contentment, hunger, alertness, and distress. The dragons, in turn, seemed to regard her as something between a parent and a pack leader. Storm grew quickly and demonstrated an aggressive, protective temperament. Whenever Katie ventured into potentially dangerous areas, Storm insisted on going first, using its body as a shield. The dragon also showed an unusual ability that Katie discovered by accident when they encountered a pocket of extreme heat in one of the ruined buildings. Storm opened its mouth and exhaled a stream of freezing mist that instantly cooled the superheated metal. Katie realized the Zethians had engineered Storm to manipulate temperature, creating ice and cold rather than the traditional fire-breathing of mythological dragons. Ember developed differently. Where Storm was bold and physical, Ember showed signs of remarkable intelligence and problem-solving ability. When Katie struggled to open a locked Zethian storage container, Ember examined the mechanism carefully and then used its claws with surgical precision to manipulate the locking mechanism. The container opened, revealing supplies that Katie had been trying to access for hours. As the dragons grew larger and stronger, Katie began teaching them more complex behaviors. She discovered that both creatures understood language far better than she had expected, responding to verbal commands after only a few repetitions. Their intelligence was clearly not natural, a product of whatever genetic manipulation the Zethians had performed. They learned to follow her hand signals, to scout ahead and report back, to guard the entrance to their shelter while she slept. But Katie also made sure to treat them as more than just tools. She talked to them constantly, sharing stories about Earth before the invasion, describing cities and oceans and all the things that no longer existed. She did not know if they understood the words, but they listened with apparent interest, their eyes tracking her movements as she spoke. 3 months after waking the dragons, Katie decided it was time to attempt something more ambitious than simple scavenging. She had been monitoring Zethian communications using equipment salvaged from various facilities, and she had detected signals indicating that a small outpost remained operational about 200 miles south, near what used to be Portland. The outpost was automated, left behind to maintain surveillance equipment, but it would contain technology and information far more advanced than anything she had found in abandoned research stations. The problem was distance. Katie could not walk 200 miles through hostile terrain, and she had no functioning vehicles. But she had 2 dragons who were now large enough to potentially carry a rider. She had watched them grow strong and coordinated, had seen them leap from high places and glide on their wings. They could not truly fly yet. Their wings were still developing, but they might be capable of covering ground faster than she could on foot. Katie spent a week preparing for the journey. She crafted a basic harness for Storm using salvaged materials, designing it to distribute her weight across the dragon's shoulders without interfering with wing movement. Storm tolerated the fitting process with patient curiosity, seeming to understand that Katie was trying to help rather than harm. The first attempt at riding was chaotic. Katie climbed onto Storm's back using the harness and immediately felt the dragon tense beneath her. Storm took 2 steps forward, then bounded suddenly, nearly throwing Katie off. She clung to the harness desperately while Storm ran in confused circles, trying to figure out what this strange weight on its back meant. After several failed attempts and one painful fall that left Katie bruised, but not seriously injured, she adjusted her approach. Instead of climbing on and expecting Storm to know what to do, she spent days just lying across the dragon's back while it stood still, letting Storm get used to her weight. She rewarded calm behavior with food and affection, gradually conditioning the dragon to accept her presence. By the end of the 2nd week, Storm could walk steadily with Katie on its back. By the end of the 3rd week, they were moving at a quick trot, and by the beginning of the 4th week, when Storm broke into a full run across an open stretch of former highway, Katie felt a surge of exhilaration she had not experienced since before the world ended. Ember watched these training sessions with obvious interest, and Katie suspected the second dragon could learn to carry a rider just as easily if needed. But for now, having one reliable mount was enough. The journey south began on a morning when the toxic clouds had temporarily cleared, revealing patches of actual blue sky. Katie packed supplies into a makeshift saddlebag, said a mental goodbye to the facility that had been her home, and climbed onto Storm's back. Ember followed alongside as they set out across the wasteland. The dragons traveled faster than Katie had dared hope. Storm maintained a steady lope that covered ground rapidly without exhausting itself, and Ember matched the pace effortlessly. They moved through the ruins of suburban neighborhoods where houses stood like broken teeth, past highways choked with the rusted remains of vehicles, through forests where trees had been burned to charcoal skeletons by Zethian weapons. Katie used the journey to scout for useful supplies and to map safe routes through the destruction. She marked locations of intact buildings, sources of water, and areas to avoid due to radiation or unstable structures. Every piece of information might be valuable later, though she still had no clear idea of what she was working toward beyond simple survival. They camped the first night in an old shopping mall, its massive interior providing shelter from the wind. Katie started a small fire using debris and shared her rations with the dragons, who had also caught their own food during the day. As she sat between the two massive creatures, feeling their warmth and listening to their steady breathing, Katie allowed herself to imagine possibilities beyond just staying alive. What if she could do more than survive? What if she could actually rebuild something? Create some kind of life worth living in this dead world? With the dragons at her side, she had capabilities no other survivor could match. Assuming any other survivors existed, she had mobility, protection, and companions who could help her accomplish tasks that would be impossible alone. The Zethian outpost represented a test of these possibilities. If she could successfully raid an active facility, if she could steal their technology and information without getting killed, then maybe she could start thinking bigger. Maybe she could begin planning not just for survival but for something approaching revenge or justice, or whatever you called making the bastards who destroyed your world regret their decision. Storm shifted in its sleep, and one large wing stretched out to partially cover Katie like a blanket. On her other side, Ember rumbled contentedly, the sound vibrating through the floor. Katie closed her eyes and let herself rest, surrounded by warmth and the presence of creatures that had somehow become her family in this broken world. The Zethian outpost squatted on the coast like a metal tumor, its black towers rising from the ruins of what had once been Portland's waterfront. Katie observed it from a hillside 2 miles away, using a salvaged pair of binoculars to study the facility's layout and defenses. Storm and Ember rested behind her, their bodies pressed low to the ground as if they understood the need for stealth. The outpost was smaller than Katie had expected, probably staffed by no more than a dozen Zethians if any actual personnel remained. Most of the facility appeared to be automated, with defensive turrets mounted at regular intervals and sensor arrays sweeping the surrounding area. Katie had learned enough about Zethian technology to recognize their security patterns, and she spent the entire day watching and timing the sensor sweeps. As evening approached, she formulated a plan that was probably suicidal, but represented her best chance of success. The western approach to the outpost had a blind spot in the sensor coverage, a small gap that lasted exactly 47 seconds during each rotation cycle. It was not much time, but if Storm could sprint fast enough, they might reach the outer wall before the sensors detected them. The real challenge would be getting inside without triggering every alarm in the facility. Katie had spent the afternoon studying the architectural details she could see through her binoculars, looking for weaknesses or access points. She noticed a ventilation shaft on the western tower that appeared large enough for a human to squeeze through, though reaching it would require climbing about 30 feet of smooth metal wall. That was where Ember would come in. The red and gold dragon had demonstrated impressive climbing abilities, using its claws to grip surfaces that seemed completely smooth. If Ember could scale the wall with Katie on its back, she could access the ventilation system and make her way inside, while the dragons created a distraction elsewhere. Katie explained the plan to her companions using a combination of words, gestures, and drawings in the dirt. She had no way to know how much they truly understood, but both dragons watched her with focused attention and responded appropriately when she rehearsed specific actions. Storm would make noise and draw attention to the eastern side of the facility, while Katie and Ember approached from the west. They waited until full darkness before making their move. The toxic clouds had returned, blocking out the stars and creating a gloom so complete that Katie could barely see her own hands. She climbed onto Storm's back and they descended from the hillside at a careful walk, covering the 2 miles to the outpost over the course of an hour. When they reached the position Katie had selected, she dismounted and checked her equipment one final time. She carried her plasma rifle, a cutting torch, a data extraction device she had built from salvaged components, and a pack full of explosives she had manufactured using chemicals from abandoned industrial sites. If things went badly, she wanted the option to blow her way out. Storm took up position near the eastern perimeter, waiting for Katie's signal. She climbed onto Ember's back and gripped the harness tightly, then gave a low whistle. Storm responded immediately, charging toward the eastern wall and releasing a tremendous roar that shattered the night silence. Alarms began screaming across the facility. Lights blazed to life and the defensive turrets swiveled toward the source of the noise. Storm weaved and dodged as energy blasts carved molten tracks through the ground, demonstrating the combat instincts that the Zethians had engineered into its genetic code. The dragon was in no real danger. The turrets were designed to target larger threats and struggled to track Storm's rapid movements. But the distraction was perfect. Katie urged Ember forward, and the dragon sprinted toward the western wall during the brief sensor gap. They reached the base of the tower undetected, and Ember immediately began climbing. Its claws found purchase on microscopic irregularities in the metal surface, and it scaled the wall with the confidence of a gecko climbing glass. Katie pressed herself flat against Ember's back, feeling the dragon's muscles bunch and release with each upward movement. 30 feet seemed much higher when you were actually climbing it, and Katie fought down a wave of vertigo as the ground receded below them. But Ember climbed steadily and surely, and within 2 minutes they reached the ventilation shaft. Katie pried open the covering using her cutting torch and squeezed into the narrow passage. She had memorized the facility's likely layout based on other Zethian outposts she had explored, and she navigated through the ventilation system toward what should be the main computer core. Behind her, she could hear the muffled sounds of Storm's continued assault on the eastern defenses. The ventilation shaft opened into a large room filled with banks of computer equipment and holographic displays. Katie dropped down silently and took a moment to orient herself. The room was empty of personnel, which confirmed her suspicion that the outpost was running on automated systems. She moved to the nearest terminal and plugged in her data extraction device. Zethian computer systems were heavily encrypted, but Katie had spent years learning their coding languages and security protocols. Her fingers flew across the alien interface, bypassing security measures and accessing the facility's database. She began downloading everything she could find. Information about Zethian fleet movements, technical specifications for their weapons, communication logs that might reveal their current activities in this sector of space. As the data transfer progressed, Katie explored the rest of the facility. She found a weapons locker and helped herself to several energy rifles and a case of power cells. She discovered a storage room containing food supplies that were infinitely better than the scraps she had been surviving on. She even found medical equipment that might prove useful for treating injuries. But the most valuable discovery was in a small laboratory on the second floor. Katie found vials of genetic material, tissue samples from dozens of different species, including humans. She also found detailed records of the Zethian bioweapon program, the same program that had created Storm and Ember. According to the files, there had been other facilities with other experimental creatures, though most had been terminated when the Empire withdrew from Earth. The data showed something else that made Katie's blood run cold. The Zethians had not simply abandoned Earth because they lost interest. They had left because they encountered something that frightened them, something powerful enough to make the Empire retreat from an entire sector of space. The logs referred to it only as the Convergence, and they indicated that Zethian High Command was consolidating forces in preparation for a major conflict. Katie was still processing this information when alarms suddenly escalated throughout the facility. She checked the security monitors and saw that Storm's distraction had worked almost too well. The dragon had damaged several turrets, and the facility's automated defense systems had classified the situation as a critical threat. Reinforcement signals were being broadcast, and according to the computer, a Zethian patrol ship would arrive within 20 minutes. She grabbed everything she could carry and ran for the ventilation shaft. The data extraction was only 70% complete, but she had no choice except to disconnect the device and retreat. She climbed back into the shaft and made her way toward the western wall, moving as quickly as the narrow space allowed. Ember was waiting when Katie emerged from the shaft, clinging to the tower wall with patient vigilance. Katie climbed onto the dragon's back and Ember descended rapidly, sometimes simply dropping several feet and catching itself with its claws. They hit the ground hard, and Katie whistled the recall signal for Storm. The blue dragon appeared moments later, racing around the corner of the facility with several turrets still tracking its movement. Katie saw scorch marks on Storm's scales where energy blasts had come close, but the dragon appeared uninjured and energized by the combat. They ran from the facility at full speed, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the outpost before the patrol ship arrived. Katie glanced back once and saw searchlights sweeping across the landscape, but the Zethians were looking in the wrong direction. By the time they figured out what had happened, Katie and the dragons would be miles away. They did not stop running until dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon. Storm and Ember were both exhausted, their sides heaving with exertion, but they had escaped successfully. Katie dismounted on shaking legs and collapsed against Storm's side, feeling the adrenaline slowly drain from her system. She had done it. She had successfully raided an active Zethian facility and stolen valuable intelligence. More importantly, she had proven that humans were not as helpless as the galaxy believed. With the dragons at her side and the knowledge she had gained, Katie was no longer just a survivor hiding in the ruins. She was becoming something more dangerous, something the Zethians had not anticipated when they wrote off Earth as a dead world. She was becoming a threat, and she was just getting started. Katie spent 3 weeks analyzing the data she had stolen from the Zethian outpost. She set up a new base of operations in an underground bunker complex beneath the ruins of Denver, a facility that had once served as a government emergency shelter and now provided her with power, security, and enough space for the dragons to move around comfortably. The information she had obtained painted a disturbing picture of galactic politics. The Zethians were not the supreme power she had imagined. They were actually a mid-tier empire, aggressive and expansionist, but ultimately answerable to a council of older and more powerful civilizations. Earth had been attacked not because it represented any threat, but simply because the Zethians needed to demonstrate military strength to maintain their position within the galactic hierarchy. The files also revealed details about the mysterious convergence that had prompted the Zethian withdrawal. Katie pieced together references from multiple documents and determined that the convergence was some kind of hive mind entity that consumed entire civilizations, absorbing their technology and biology into an ever-growing collective. The Zethians had encountered convergence forces in a neighboring sector and had pulled back their military assets to defend their core territories. This meant Earth had been forgotten not out of mercy or disinterest, but simply because the Zethians had bigger problems to worry about. Humanity had been declared extinct as a matter of administrative convenience, a way to close the books on a conquered world that no longer served any strategic purpose. Katie found this information both infuriating and useful. The galactic community believed humans were gone, which meant she could operate with an element of surprise. More importantly, the files contained access, codes for Zethian communication, networks, and detailed maps showing the locations of other abandoned facilities across Earth and on nearby planets. She began planning a campaign that went far beyond simple survival. If the galaxy thought humanity was extinct, she would prove them wrong in the most dramatic way possible. She would hit Zethian facilities, steal their technology, and make enough noise to force the Galactic Council to acknowledge that Earth was still inhabited and still fighting. But she needed more than just 2 dragons and her own determination. She needed resources, weapons, and possibly allies if any other human survivors existed. Katie decided to start by exploring other locations marked on the Zethian maps as research facilities. If Storm and Ember had been left behind in stasis, there might be other experimental creatures or useful technology waiting to be discovered. The nearest facility was located in what used to be Montana, about 500 miles north of her current position. Katie prepared for an extended expedition, packing supplies and equipment onto a makeshift harness system she had designed to let the dragons carry cargo. Storm and Ember had grown substantially over the past months, now each measuring nearly 20 feet from snout to tail, and they were strong enough to carry significant weight. The journey north took them through diverse landscapes of destruction. They passed through regions where Zethian weapons had turned the ground to glass, creating vast plains that reflected the toxic sky like dark mirrors. They crossed areas where biological experiments had gone wrong, producing forests of mutated plants that grew in impossible configurations, their leaves absorbing compounds that would have been toxic to normal vegetation. Katie documented everything she saw, recording video on a salvage camera and taking notes about potential resources or hazards. She was building a database of information about Earth's current condition, driven by the half-formed hope that someday there might be other humans to share it with. On the 5th day of travel, they encountered something unexpected. Storm, who had been scouting ahead, returned and alerted Katie with a series of urgent chirps. The dragon's body language suggested it had found something important, and Katie followed Storm to a ridge overlooking a valley. Below them was a settlement, a collection of crude shelters built from salvaged materials, and surrounded by a defensive wall constructed from shipping containers and concrete barriers. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and Katie could see figures moving between the buildings. Humans, at least a dozen of them, surviving in an organized community. Katie's first instinct was to approach immediately, to rush down and greet fellow survivors after years of isolation. But caution held her back. She had no idea what kind of society these people had built, or how they would react to a stranger arriving with 2 enormous dragons. She decided to observe for a while before revealing herself. Over the course of a day, Katie watched the settlement and learned about its inhabitants. They had established a functioning community with assigned roles and shared labor. She saw people tending gardens where they grew mutated but edible plants, others working on repairing equipment, and guards patrolling the perimeter. The settlement appeared peaceful and organized, a small pocket of human civilization persisting against all odds. As evening approached, Katie made her decision. She told Storm and Ember to wait on the ridge, then walked down into the valley alone with her hands clearly visible and her weapons secured on her back. The settlement's guards spotted her immediately, and within minutes she was surrounded by a half-dozen people pointing makeshift weapons at her. Katie raised her hands and spoke clearly, identifying herself and explaining that she meant no harm. The guards exchanged uncertain glances, and eventually an older woman stepped forward. She introduced herself as Linda Chen, the settlement's leader, and demanded to know where Katie had come from and whether she had been followed. Katie told them an abbreviated version of her story, carefully leaving out the details about the dragons for the moment. She explained that she had been surviving alone for years, scavenging through ruins and avoiding Zethian patrols. Linda listened with obvious skepticism, but eventually ordered the guards to lower their weapons. The settlement's population consisted of 23 people, survivors who had found each other in the years following the invasion and gradually built this community. They had established systems for growing food, purifying water, and defending against the occasional automated Zethian drone that still patrolled some regions. They were surviving, but just barely, and they lived in constant fear of discovery. Katie spent the evening talking with Linda and other settlement leaders, sharing information about the Zethian withdrawal and the galactic situation. They were fascinated by what she had learned, but also frightened by the implications. If the Zethians or other alien powers decided to return to Earth, the settlement would have no way to defend itself. When Katie finally mentioned the dragons, the reaction was mixed. Some people were terrified at the idea of Zethian bioweapons living so close to their community. Others were intrigued and wanted to see the creatures. Linda remained thoughtfully silent, processing the information. Eventually, Linda made a decision. She told Katie that the settlement would welcome her if she chose to stay, but they could not allow the dragons inside the defensive perimeter. The people had survived this long by being cautious, and introducing unknown variables like genetically engineered predators was too great a risk. Katie understood their position, but knew she could not abandon Storm and Ember. The dragons were not just tools or weapons, they were her family, the only companions she had known for years. She politely declined the offer to join the settlement permanently, but proposed an alternative arrangement. She would continue her mission to raid Zethian facilities and gather resources, and she would share useful technology and information with the settlement. In return, the settlement could serve as a trading post and information hub, a place where Katie could resupply and potentially meet other survivor groups. Linda agreed to this arrangement, recognizing that Katie's mobility and combat capability could benefit everyone. Over the next few days, Katie shared supplies she had scavenged, including Zethian food rations, medical supplies, and some basic tools. In exchange, the settlement provided her with fresh vegetables from their gardens, the first real food she had tasted in years, and detailed information about other survivor groups they had heard about through radio communications. Katie learned that scattered communities of humans existed across North America and possibly other continents, small groups of people clinging to life in the ruins. Most were isolated and struggling, unaware that the Zethians had withdrawn or that the galactic community believed humanity was extinct. This revelation transformed Katie's mission. She was not just one woman surviving in a dead world. She was potentially the most mobile and well-armed human on the planet. With the dragons and her growing collection of alien technology, she could become a link between scattered survivor groups, a courier of information and resources. More importantly, she could become a symbol. If word spread that a human was successfully raiding Zethian facilities and fighting back against the alien occupiers, it might inspire others to believe that survival was not enough, that resistance was possible. The Montana facility was different from the others Katie had explored. While most Zethian installations had been hastily abandoned with equipment left scattered and databases wiped clean, this one appeared to have been deliberately preserved. The main entrance was sealed but not damaged, and when Katie accessed the security systems using her stolen codes, she found that backup power was still running at nearly full capacity. Storm and Ember waited outside while Katie entered alone, her rifle ready and her senses alert for any sign of danger. The facility's interior was pristine, almost as if the Zethian researchers had just stepped out for a break and would return at any moment. Lights activated automatically as she moved through the corridors, and the air filtration system hummed quietly in the background. Katie found the main laboratory on the third sub-level, and what she discovered there made her stop in her tracks. The room contained dozens of stasis tanks similar to the ones where she had found Storm and Ember, but these were all empty except for one. Inside that single remaining tank was a creature unlike anything she had seen before. It was humanoid in basic shape, but clearly not human. Its skin had a crystalline quality that refracted light in strange patterns, and its proportions were slightly wrong, limbs too long and fingers too numerous. According to the terminal beside the tank, this was a Viridian, a species that had been conquered by the Zethians 3 decades ago. This individual had been kept as a test subject for genetic experiments. Katie read through the files and learned that the Viridians had possessed advanced technology before their conquest, particularly in the fields of energy manipulation and faster-than-light travel. The Zethians had been trying to extract and replicate these capabilities through biological experimentation. This particular Viridian, identified in the records only as Subject 17, had survived longer than any other test subject. The ethical implications made Katie uncomfortable, but she also recognized an opportunity. If she could wake this being and it proved friendly, she would gain access to knowledge far beyond anything humanity had possessed, even before the invasion. More importantly, she would have proof that humans were not the only species still resisting Zethian domination. Even in a small way, she initiated the revival sequence, watching as the stasis fluid drained and the Viridian began to stir. The being's eyes opened, revealing irises that swirled with colors Katie had no names for. Those alien eyes focused on her with immediate and sharp intelligence, and Katie found herself being evaluated by a mind that had experienced things she could barely imagine. The Viridian spoke, and Katie's salvage translator device struggled to process the language before producing understandable words. The being's first question was simple and direct. How long had it been unconscious, and were the Zethians still present? Katie explained the situation as clearly as she could, describing the invasion of Earth, the Zethian withdrawal, and her own survival with the dragons. The Viridian listened without interruption, its crystalline features impossible to read. When Katie finished, the being remained silent for a long moment before responding. Its name was Kyre, and it had been a navigation specialist on a Viridian colony ship before the Zethians attacked its homeworld. Kyre had been captured during the invasion, and subjected to years of experimentation before being placed in stasis. The being expressed no surprise at learning that decades had passed. only a weary resignation that spoke to traumas Katie could only partially understand. Kyer examined the laboratory with evident bitterness, recognizing equipment and research notes related to the experiments performed on its species. But the Viridian also demonstrated pragmatism, immediately identifying technology that could be useful and suggesting modifications Katie had never considered for her salvaged equipment. Over the following days, an unlikely partnership formed. Kyer possessed theoretical knowledge about technology that Katie had been struggling to understand through trial and error. In exchange, Katie provided Kyer with information about the current galactic situation and protection in a hostile world. The Viridian was physically weak after years of imprisonment and experimentation, but its mind remained sharp and its determination to resist the Zethians had not diminished. Together, they explored the rest of the Montana facility and made several valuable discoveries. They found a small spacecraft in a concealed hangar, a Zethian scout ship that was still functional. Kyer examined the vessel and declared that with some modifications, it could be made capable of reaching orbital stations and possibly even traveling to nearby planets. This changed everything. Katie had been thinking in terms of surviving on Earth and harassing the few Zethian installations that remained. But with a functional spacecraft, she could expand her operations dramatically. She could potentially reach the automated stations the Zethians had left in orbit around Earth and other planets in the solar system. She could gather resources and technology that were completely inaccessible from the surface. They also found weapons more advanced than anything Katie had previously obtained, including a device Kyer identified as a plasma lance capable of punching through starship armor. There were portable shield generators, medical equipment that could heal injuries in hours rather than weeks, and communication systems that could theoretically reach across star systems. Katie and Kyer spent 2 weeks at the Montana facility, cataloging resources and planning their next moves. Kyer taught Katie about galactic politics and technology, filling in gaps in her knowledge and correcting misconceptions she had developed. The Viridian explained that the Galactic Council was not a unified government but rather a loose alliance of powerful species that maintained order through a combination of diplomacy and overwhelming, forced species that demonstrated sufficient technological capability and military strength could petition for representation on the council. Species that were conquered or destroyed were simply noted in historical archives and forgotten. The Zethians had attacked Earth because they needed to demonstrate continued expansion to maintain their council status, not because humans posed any actual threat. This information crystallized Katie's long-term goals. If she could demonstrate that humanity still existed and still possessed the will to fight, she might be able to force the Galactic Council to acknowledge Earth as an active civilization rather than a dead world. It would require dramatic action, something that could not be ignored or dismissed. Kyer supported this goal, seeing it as an opportunity to strike back at the Zethians and the Council that had allowed such atrocities to occur. The Viridian began teaching Katie how to pilot the scout ship, and together they formulated a plan that was ambitious to the point of absurdity. In 2 months, the Galactic Council would hold a major assembly on a space station orbiting Jupiter. Representatives from dozens of species would gather to discuss territorial disputes and trade agreements. The Zethians would send a delegation to argue for expanded territorial claims, using humanity's extinction as justification for colonizing the entire Sol system. Katie and Kyer planned to attend that assembly uninvited. They would arrive in the scout ship, force their way into the council chambers if necessary, and present evidence that humanity survived and refused to accept Zethian claims on their home system. It was dangerous and potentially suicidal, but it was also exactly the kind of dramatic gesture that might force the galactic community to pay attention. They returned to Katie's Denver bunker to prepare, bringing the scout ship and as much equipment as they could transport. Storm and Ember had grown even larger during the weeks in Montana, and they would need to remain on Earth during the space journey. Katie spent long hours with the dragons trying to explain that she would be leaving temporarily but would return. She did not know if they truly understood, but both dragons seemed to sense that something significant was happening. They stayed close to her during the preparation period, and Ember developed a habit of gently touching Katie's shoulder with its snout, as if seeking reassurance. The survivor settlement sent representatives to the Denver bunker when they heard about Katie's plan. Linda Chen argued that it was too dangerous, that Katie would be throwing away her life for a symbolic gesture that might accomplish nothing. But other survivors supported the mission, recognizing that someone needed to tell the galaxy that humanity refused to be forgotten. Katie spent her final days on Earth visiting survivor settlements she had located during her travels, sharing supplies and information. She met dozens of other humans who had survived the invasion, and their stories filled her with determination. These people had endured unimaginable hardships and continued fighting for survival every day. They deserved to have their existence acknowledged, their struggle recognized. On the morning of departure, Katie stood with Storm and Ember one final time. She wrapped her arms around each dragon's neck and promised she would come back. Then she climbed into the scout ship with Kyre, sealed the hatch, and lifted off toward the stars. Behind them, the dragons roared their farewell, a sound that echoed across the ruins of Denver and reminded the dead world that something still lived and still fought in the ashes of what once was.